see a few new faces, so those repeat offenders will indulge me to say that the Wilson Center is the former memorial to Woodrow Wilson. We're a nonpartisan, non-advocacy forum for bringing the worlds of scholarship and the worlds of policy and practice together with sessions like this that try to bring the best of research and best of commentary, in this case from the journalism world, somebody who's followed these issues very closely, bring them together and have an engaged and lively discussion with all of you who are reflective of that world of research, policy, and practice. So it's a real thrill to welcome Malcolm and Ann to the Wilson Center. The Environmental Change and Security Program, we're a 14-year-old program that with the same target audiences tries to focus on issues of environment, health, population, development, foreign and security policy. And so certainly in that population demography category and that security category and that health category, we have a real fundamental contribution to the literature that we're talking about today with Malcolm's book, where he really held back in entitling it Sex and War, How Biology Explains War and Offers a Path to Peace. Always the shrinking violet, Malcolm Potts. And so it's a thrill that he's agreed to come talk about this new book at the Wilson Center. We've had terrific collaboration and work with Malcolm and Martha before, and so it's a thrill to have them back at the center. Malcolm, as I think you know, holds the Bixby Endowed Chair at the University of California at Berkeley, where he established the Bixby Center for Population Health and Sustainability. So truly a place that is trying to break down some of the disciplinary barriers across these issues. One achievement among too few in doing that on major college campuses, and so it's terrific that he has done that and been able to bring this research and train a new generation of researchers in looking at these issues together. So it's a thrill to have Malcolm here, and you can all see from the handout the more detailed background on both Malcolm, but also Ann Gibbons, who's been a correspondent at Science magazine for more than a decade, where she's really a leading, if not the leading, correspondent covering evolutionary biology. And so it's a real thrill for her to join us and share her reflections on this topic and the book. And so it's a thrill to welcome her to the center for the first time. And I will say two other notes before we turn the floor over to Malcolm. One is that, as many of you know, we, with the various generous support from USAID's Office of Population and Reproductive Health that makes meetings like this possible, but also some of our online and hard copy publications, we are just now putting up, it's on the web, and you can find the cheat sheet list of them, 6 articles on demography and security. And I think they will be ones that fit very well and are complementary to and have different takes on some of the questions that we're talking about today. So I hope you will pick that up, find that online, and engage in the discussion as we try to have those authors reflect in video, in short commentary, and longer form, and variety of formats coming here to the center to speak on their pieces, that you can engage in that and share these insights as well. The other is, after we're done, we have a reception. And it's one floor down, and I hope you will all join us for that. So Malcolm, without further ado, I'd love to turn the floor over to you.
You know how
Get you out of here.
cold. Okay.
They don't give us much space up here.
There we are. Well, thank you very much. Look forward to the opportunity to try and look at warfare and terrorism in some new ways. And I'm especially looking forward to the discussion, as Jeff just mentioned. Oopsie. I still choke up when I look at this picture. When I was working in Liberia, a nurse told me she'd been dressing the wounds of a girl whose hands had been chopped off with a machete. And innocently, the girl asked, "Nurse, will my hands grow again?" Liberia is the wettest part of West Africa, and everything regrows except, unfortunately, human hands. I was a child in World War II. I can remember the noise of V-1 buzz bombs, and I recall seeing the sky filled with squadrons of American and British bombers going over to attack Germany. These were very brave men. They had an appalling mortality. I still respect them. Some of them attended the church my parents went to. As a physician working internationally since the 1960s, I've been on the edge of a number of conflicts, from Gaza and Afghanistan. I was in Phnom Penh during the siege. So I asked myself, why do human beings systematically and deliberately kill our own species? As a biologist, I know this is a very unusual behavior. Stags and bull elephants sometimes kill one another fighting over females. But it's really only chimpanzees and human beings, and possibly hyenas and wolves, where you have teams of adult animals that deliberately set out to enlarge their territories by systematically killing other members of their own species. When I was a student at Cambridge, I had the same tutor as Jane Goodall, and that was a time when the standard social science models dominated our thinking. Human beings, it was asserted, are a blank sheet who need somehow or other to be taught to be violent. Jane's research on chimpanzees changed that view. Chimpanzees are highly social animals. They are stubbornly territorial. And wherever primatologists have studied them for some time, Pan troglodytes, the species that Jane studies, sooner or later have been seen adult males, small group, to leave the territory in which they're living, change their behavior, become very cautious and alert, to go in a stealthy manner into a neighboring territory, and if they find an isolated individual belonging to another troop, they attack that individual in the most brutal manner imaginable, tearing off strips of flesh with their teeth, twisting limbs out of their sockets, stamping on them, and usually the attacked individual dies within a day or two of shock and blood loss. Up to 1/3 of chimpanzees are killed by other chimpanzees. Such raids enable victorious animals to extend their territory. This was a territory of a group of chimps that Jane studied before they started these raids, and they got a larger territory by killing their neighbors. And a larger territory means more resources, more fruiting trees, more females can come in, and ultimately the successful warriors leave more of their genes in the next generation because they father more children, which is the ultimate test of Darwinian evolution. Tomorrow is the 200th anniversary of Charles Darwin's birth and the 150th of the publication of The Origin of Species. Darwin understood that males and females have different reproductive agenda. Genuinely monogamous animals, such as penguins, the two sexes are the same size and indistinguishable. Among polygamous or promiscuous animals, where the males compete for females, males are bigger than females. We are such a sexually dimorphic species. And men and women have different reproductive behaviors. It makes reproductive sense for men to take more risks than women. If I show you the statistics that young men break their long bones more often than young women, you might argue, well, perhaps this is a cultural thing, perhaps parents don't give their daughters mountain bikes for their birthdays. But if I show you that male chimpanzees fall out of trees more often than female chimps, perhaps you'll see that at least in part this is an inherited behavior. This morning's Washington Post picked up on this theme. It's not a silly speculation. There is data to show that men who are exposed to high levels of testosterone in utero in certain financial posts actually earn more money because they take more risks than men that were exposed to lower testosterone levels. In 1996, Richard Wrangham and a colleague who worked with Jane Goodall described team aggression in chimpanzees in a book called Demonic Males. In Sex and War, Thomas Hayden and I take off where Richard stopped. We find an unbroken tale of violence and same-species killing in the fossil record, in archaeology, anthropology, and written history. After writing Sex and War, I have concluded that the ultimate weapon of mass destruction, and perhaps of economic destruction, is the testosterone molecule. This Paleolithic cave painting from tens of thousands of years ago shows some warriors setting out to attack their neighbors. The only intact corpse which we have from the Neolithic is this 5,300-year-old man that came out of the melting glaciers in the Alps. He had an arrow in his back and 3 different human blood groups on his tunic. The Highlander population of New Guinea, who lived a Stone Age way of life until the first contact with Europeans in the 1920s, and when their life histories have been reconstructed, then like chimpanzees, 20 to 30% of adults are killed in raids and wars. It's the same among the Yanomamo in South America, and a mind-boggling 4 out of 10 adults have taken part in killing another human being. In 1987, some anthropologists and sociologists made a statement at UNESCO that it is scientifically incorrect to say we've inherited a tendency to make war from our animal ancestors. I think that that is wrong. Evolutionary psychology posits that the human brain has inherited predispositions on mental frameworks which evolved because they helped us to adapt, to find food, select mates, avoid danger, and compete for resources in a hostile world. I suggest that there's strong evidence of a genetic tendency for men in the prime of life to attack and kill their neighbors. But such predispositions are extraordinarily flexible. And I'm not trying to suggest that we're preordained to go out and kill other people, because nature as well as nurture, nurture as well as nature is highly influential. So I'm not maintaining that men have inherited a predisposition. I'm maintaining they've inherited a predisposition for team aggression. But I also recognize and I celebrate the role of culture. If chimpanzees were literate, I suggest they would identify with Shakespeare's words, "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers." In World War II, William Manchester, the journalist, described his life as a US Marine fighting in the Pacific. Like chimps and our hominid and human ancestors, Manchester tells us that men who are under fire in combat do not fight for flag, country, for the Marine Corps, or glory, or any other abstraction. They fight for one another. Even terrorists show this affinity. The Al-Qaeda troop who attacked America on 9/11, like a raiding band of chimps or New Guinea Highlanders, contained 2 brothers. Glenn Gray received his PhD in philosophy from Princeton on the same day that he got his draft papers in World War II, and he fought in Europe. And he captures the intense loyalty of warriors who are loyal to each other without thought of personal loss. The reward of writing a book is that it helps you define new questions. As I read words like these, I realize more and more that if we're a very social animal, indeed we are, and if we've evolved to systematically and deliberately kill our neighbors, then we must also have evolved a mechanism to dehumanize or de-chimpanzeeize those who are about us. As the famous Stanford prison experiment demonstrated, and as Abu Ghraib confirmed, the nicest university students and the best trained soldiers in the world can dehumanize an outgroup with the greatest of ease. None of us in this room would be here if we'd not had ancestors who were successful at killing their neighbors. Most of us even had parents or grandparents who were in the armed forces. My brother fought in Korea. My father was the crew of an airship in 1918, an improbable but at the time rather frightening fighting vehicle. My wife's uncle was the first American ace in World War I. I suggest that as we think about confronting warfare and terrorism, then, as in medicine, the correct diagnosis is imperative. Once we recognize our violent origins, then we need to ask not why do wars break out, but why does peace break out? We may have a predisposition to be warriors, but we're not preordained to be warriors. Civilization at its best, and the forces of modern culture, can overcome our natural warrior tendencies. Today, it's totally unthinkable that Britain would go to war with Germany, except on a soccer field. In fact, one of the big surprises of writing this book was that the 20th century judged on the basis of same species killing per 1,000 of the population per generation, may have been the most peaceful in human history. When I was writing this book, I would show something to my wife that I'd written about team aggression in human beings, and Martha would say, "That's not what human beings do, that's what men do." Team aggression, I suggest, benefited successful warrior males, but it never benefited females. Team aggression does not produce more fruit in the forest for chimpanzees, it simply redistributes it between competing male territories. Women will fight very courageously when they or their children are threatened. But in the whole of recorded history, I cannot find a single example of women banding together spontaneously and then going out to attack a neighboring group. In the 19th century, the West African kings of Dahomey had a female army, and their fighting qualities are well attested by the French Foreign Legion, who were their enemy. But they were basically excess concubines, and they were literally whipped into battle. Some individual suicide bombers have been women, but usually from families who had a loved one killed by the group being attacked. And those who manipulate terrorists sometimes recognize that you can get a woman through a tight security cordon easier than a man. The takeaway message for those of us who want to live in a more peaceful world, I suggest, is that anything that contributes to the autonomy of women and gives them a role in civil society is likely to reduce international and domestic conflict. Because team aggression is primarily driven by males in the 15 to 29-year-old age group, as for example in El Salvador in the 1980s, this is the group that's most likely to engage in wars and to generate terrorists. Compare this with a country such as Sweden, which is much less likely to be involved in violent conflicts and has these sort of older men and women to dilute these more volatile young men. It follows that giving freedom to women to decide if and when to have a child not only builds female autonomy, reduces infant and maternal mortality, accelerates economic growth, but can contribute to peace in a very real way. It reduces the overall competition for resources, and it changes the population structures of this kind of age pyramid. The 9/11 Commission drew attention to the relationship between rapid population growth, unemployment, and terrorism. It describes a steadily increasing population of young men without any reasonable expectation of suitable or steady employment is a sure prescription for social turbulence. Look at these countries. By 2025, which isn't all that far away, there'll be 25 million men aged 15 to 29 in Pakistan. The total population of Pakistan in 1949 at partition was 36 million. The Gaza Strip will have over twice as many men, and they'll all be unemployed, in my experience. Yemen will continue to be a failed state, and Iraq may go in the same direction. But what about the last country, the Islamic Republic of Iran? I worked in Iran a lot under the old Shah, and I went back more recently. Family size in Iran plummeted from an average of 5.5 to 2 children in 15 years, as rapidly as China, but without a one-child policy. The Holy Quran and the sayings of the Holy Prophet endorsed the use of azl, the Arabic word for male withdrawal. Iran built its own contraceptive factories, and everyone marrying in Iran is required to go to lectures on contraception, which might be quite a good idea in this country. There are now more women in Tehran University than men, and I forecast in a generation's time, Iran will be more peaceful and stable than Pakistan, Iraq, or Afghanistan. Iran, I think, demonstrates the remarkable power of making voluntary contraception easily accessible. There is a large, well-documented need for family planning. That is, women who say they don't want another child immediately, or they never want to have another child. I suggest that family size will fall everywhere and anywhere. I'm jumping about too much. Defeated by this. Excuse me. I suggest that family size will fall anywhere and everywhere when we do two things. First, we remove the unnecessary, non-evidence-based barriers to modern contraception, which so often exist. And second, we correct misinformation about contraception, which is very widespread. Many women think taking the pill is more dangerous than another pregnancy. Perhaps family size wouldn't fall as rapidly in Afghanistan as it did in Iran, but I think it will always fall. And that access to family planning not only directly benefits women and their families, but it's a wanted, achievable policy that can make the world a more peaceful place. Sex and war are linked by evolution. Modern medicine has opened the door to a more peaceful world, and let us go through it. And if I can find my last slide, it's rather a nice one that accompanied a op-ed I wrote, or my wife and I wrote. I'll leave it on the screen. The pill is mightier than the sword. Thank you.
That's perfect. Well, I enjoyed that. I have to say, first off, I live in Pittsburgh. I'm from the Steeler Nation, so I know a little something about male coalitional aggression. The night the Steelers won the Super Bowl, there was pillaging in the streets, damaged buildings. It was quite interesting. I also write about human evolution for science, which, as my brother-in-law, who's in the audience, said, is sort of the type specimen, if that means anything for you, for aggression in the sciences. It's the field where there's sort of the most competition, one of the fields where there's intense competition for access to fossil sites, and it brings out very aggressive behavior. So first-hand observation. Malcolm Potts, I wanted to say, has made, for me, in reading his book, which is really interesting, a very good read, really well written. I enjoyed it. Lots of good stories from your travels around the world. Wonderful tidbits about things like the origins of the word bereavement. It came from the Reivers. These were armed raiders in northern England that had skirmishes with the Scots. So they're wonderful bits of where some of the origins of our words have come from in our current language, from aggression. The book is not only a good read, but for me it was steeped in really good high-quality research on primate studies and human origin studies and the fossil record. He makes a very strong case that men have inherited a predisposition to band together to wage battle. Call it the Genghis Khan effect. It means that they get to spread a few men who are better at taking over new territory, get new resources, they get women and more food, their genes spread farther. And as he showed us again, this is not necessarily true for women. It's just a redistribution of resources that doesn't help the entire community. As a writer who's focused on human evolution for many years, I've been drawn to writing about the evolution of human behavior, especially the dark side of human behavior. Origins of cannibalism is one of the topics I've written about, and Malcolm documents this in his book as well. Humans are capable of incredible acts of kindness, but also despicable acts of terror. We murder, slaughter, barbecue, and even eat our own species, and we've been doing it for a long time. And just how long is one of the central questions of the book and several lines of research for different researchers I write about. Cannibalism has now been documented to go back at least 800,000 years ago in Atapuerca, Spain, where an ancestor of humans and Neanderthals, juveniles, have bones that have been processed like animal bones, marrow smashed open as if they were eating them. And this has become a science that has a man at Berkeley, Tim White, has established criteria for deciding if a fossil has been processed for cannibalism, not just carnivore cut marks. There's a skull from Ethiopia, about 600,000 years old, possibly older fossils. I was just in the field with a researcher who does this work in Ethiopia, and there's some possible signs of earlier signs of cannibalism. It's been found in Neanderthals in France. The first archaeological evidence of warfare doesn't appear until much later, and Malcolm writes about that in his book, probably more with the advent of city-states after agriculture began 10,000 years ago. So somewhere between 8,000 and 5,000 years ago, when we have much more complex societies and division of labor and a few people dominating power, we begin to see much more organized warfare and strong evidence, and then very quickly it becomes rampant and widespread in every culture. So it's all over. Researchers, as I said, have been pondering whether humans whether this is inherent, is this an ancient behavior we inherited from a very early ancestor, or is it more recent? And again, that's in the book. Potts talks about some of the intellectual heritage just briefly. There's been sort of the Rousseauian view. The French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, along with other researchers such as Ashley Montagu, thought that our ancestors lived in a peaceful world, this sort of innocent natives view. Others, notably the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes, argued that warfare is the norm, that inherently every culture will return to warfare, that we're violent by nature. This pessimistic model influenced some of the early work in human origins. When Darwin first predicted that we arose from ancestors in Africa in 1871 in his book The Descent of Man, there was no fossil evidence that he knew of. There was a Neanderthal that had been discovered, but his friend, he was told, don't worry, it's not a hominid. To make a long story short, the first fossil didn't come from Africa until 1924, the onechild, and Raymond Dart would call it the killer ape because it had these massive jaws. Killer ape, and there was all sorts of projection of very violent behavior. Well, it now turns out the research on the killer jaws, these were they would eat nuts, hard nuts, and that's just the kind of massive jaw that it's a dietary adaptation, not necessarily something being done for violence. So which view is correct? What is the ancestral state? There were many different kinds of human ancestors we evolved in the last 4 to 6 million years in Africa, and there were many different ways to be human. It's very interesting to me, all the different types of human ancestors. There are no other human species alive to show us different models for male aggression. We just don't have them. So we have to, one, look at the fossils, look at DNA and see what's been selected for, and also look to our closest relatives, the chimpanzees and gorillas, to see what are their social models, what are the males doing there. And I should say it's an auspicious time for us to be thinking about this because tomorrow on Darwin's 200th birthday, there's going to be a major announcement of researchers in Germany have sequenced the Neanderthal genome for the first time, the entire genome. And I can tell you it won't be long before researchers, they have to analyze it, they've just started looking at it, before they start looking for differences in traits, such as traits, testosterone, regulation of aggression. I'm sure that will come out at some point. I don't know how well tied the research has been to finding the underlying genetics of aggression, but you can bet that they'll be looking for behavioral differences in the Neanderthal genome. Really interesting to me is the notion, if there were many different ways to be a human ancestor, that there's variation between species, but also within species. So as I write about the past fossils, I'm curious, were males always so aggressive? And were every species as aggressive? Did Homo erectus bands go out on raids? Did Australopithecines? We don't really know. So one of my questions here is, I'm going to skip ahead here. Dr. Potts has has found and talks about research that Richard Wrangham did and some other researchers on chimpanzees looking at pan-troglodytes, which is the chimpanzee you're probably most familiar with, the common chimpanzee. In these groups, the males band together, as he said, to murder chimpanzees from other groups to get access to new territory and more resources. They have intense competition for food and resources. Curiously, though, there's no team aggression among the males in bonobos, which is Pan-paniscus, another species of chimpanzees. We see more balance of the sexes. The females are more empowered. They actually use sex to do that, to bond very closely. So it's harder for the males to break them up. And the females are more quickly, they'll get meat. They have more power in all different ways. So they're showing us a different model. And I think one of my questions is, there are many of us assume that the more aggressive model might have been what came from the common ancestor we shared with chimpanzees, but bonobos are showing us another model. There was probably variation in aggression in the ancestral populations that gave rise to chimpanzees and humans, and variation in the populations of early human ancestors. In fact, a very interesting trait shows up in the first fossils in the human lineage. One of the defining traits of being a member of the human family rather than chimpanzees is upright walking. Another one is a reduced canine in males, a smaller canine. You get a big dagger-like canine in chimpanzees. One thought is there's a change in social structure, less fighting, less biting between males. Now, that could also mean that they got better at teamwork.
Yeah, or bigger weapons.
Exactly. So we don't see tools until 2.7 million years ago, and the teeth are reduced around 4.5 to 5 million years ago. So these are interesting questions. What did those social models look like? And one thing that we can't do but be so interesting, and we were talking about this at lunch today, what if you took a chimpanzee and put it in an environment where it had less competition for resources like a bonobo, more readily food, would we see over time an evolution to a different kind of social structure? So I say that only because I think it's an interesting, we have to be careful about assuming how deep what the ancestral condition was there. So where are we going? This is the other question. We are still evolving. One of the really interesting discoveries of the last 3 years are researchers, as they look at the Human Genome Project, the HapMap project, mapping human genes, have discovered there are many, many genes that have come under natural selection that have evolved in the last 100,000 years since modern humans spread out of Africa. And you have to think of all these different populations that went off into different parts of the globe, and they evolved differences. So there's variation in diet, response to illness, perhaps in aggression. And it would be interesting to see, are there any cultures, have you come across any cultures where there are men that are less aggressive, where there's been selection for that? Or today, are we seeing in our sexual selection mates being chosen that are a little less aggressive? I mean, it'd be interesting to think that we are still evolving. The story isn't over yet. Finally, we get to solutions. How do we, in the face of this genetic predisposition to be very aggressive males, I'm all for empowering women. I won't fight against that. But also treating the conditions that allow violence. I think you've got that. I guess the one last question I have about that is, certainly you see cycles, it's almost a biological response where young males seem addicted to violence. When you think of the IRA or Bosnia and Serbia, what do you do when there are negotiations, they do everything they can to destroy that peacemaking? Do you give up on that older generation? Do you put all the resources in the young? I mean, that was another question for me and how you proceed in the future. So I think I'll stop at that.
Great. Thank you very much, James. Terrific. Well, Malcolm and Ann have left us some good time for discussion. I should have mentioned before, but I'll do it now, that we are fortunate to be webcasting today's event live on the internet, and then we'll have this video archived. So what that means practically for us here in the room is that when you have a question, one of my colleagues will bring you a microphone so that the folks online can hear it. If you are online, watching online, if you'd like to submit a question for our panelists, you can do that at ecsp@wilsoncenter.org, and if you do that relatively soon, we'll try to get that into the discussion. And then also you should be able to find Malcolm's slides on the website next to the video feed so that you can see those more easily as well. So who would like to kick us off in our conversation and discussion as we discuss this really interesting book, Sex and War? Okay, Mitzi Wertheim in the middle.
I'm Mitzi Wertheim. I run something called the Energy Consensus at the moment. I'm really interested in this. I've spent 32 years with the Defense Department. I'm a social anthropologist by training, and I came in and it was clear to me testosterone rarely ran the Pentagon. The meetings are very different if they're with just men or if they're men and women. There's been an interesting discussion that's been going on as the nature of war is changing. It's no longer the World War II model where you have nation against nation and you can use the words victory and defeat. It's not the kind of game we're in today. And there were discussions a year ago about whether or not defense ought to start drafting or trying to get people in at the age of 26 or older, because the problems they're facing are different than the kinds of things where young men with high testosterone levels find an acceptable way to get into fights. And so there are a lot of very interesting issues related to this. The problem is by the time you're 26, you tend to be less interested in going in. You've already created another life. And I'm sort of wondering what kind of advice you have. I was at a session this morning where they were talking about how the jobs are very different. It's about collaboration, talking, listening. These aren't skills I've seen young males good at.
I come from the University of Berkeley, where the military are rather unpopular. I think one of the things that I've learned reading this book is a great respect for the military profession. It has some very thoughtful people, all countries have armies and probably will for the foreseeable future. And I think the kind of things you're saying about the military rethinking what they have to do is very important and should be encouraged. And we really need more interchange between biologists and anthropologists and people in the Pentagon and the military, and we need to respect each other and listen to one another. And I hadn't thought of that idea, but I think people join in the military when they're older. I mean, it's very difficult to know what on earth you can do in Afghanistan. I mean, it is a nightmare situation. And you would certainly need older people who could relate to the local warlords, who could try and do something to help women who live in such an appalling situation in Afghanistan. But unless we do that, we're just throwing troops there, young troops with guns, is not going to solve the Afghan problem.
I just remember when we first went into Afghanistan, I remember thinking, surely we have cultural anthropologists advising our strategists. We didn't. No. I think we paid a big price for not having a better understanding of the people on the ground and working with them as allies.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, this, and Mitzi, correct me if I don't get the title right, but the human terrain system or human terrain program explicitly recognizing the shortfall and bringing in from outside the military sociologists, anthropologists, and, well, I guess embedding them in some sense, but attaching them to forward deployed units to have that, share that appreciation. Quite controversial program in some ways too, because of course it allows the military to better identify the folks who are in the ones that they're trying to find, direct opposition to. And so it's allowing for more precision in the interventions, but of course that can be quite controversial as well.
Can I just add to that?
Sure, if you'd like to follow up, get to the microphone again. It should be, go ahead. No.
No, she hands it to a man.
They have technical skills. I understand that. It's been interesting at Defense because, in fact, we used anthropologists, as I'm sure many of you know, in World War II with great success. There's an anthropologist by the name of Montgomery McFate who about 4 years ago or 5 years ago had an amazing conference with about 120 anthropologists. I've never been among so many ever in my life before. But they had no interest in being a part of the Defense Department for exactly what you, Jeff, were pointing out. I mean, they don't want to be the ones. They've established a relationship in these places, and they don't want to basically lose it. Mm-hmm. So but this process of recognizing, I mean, the whole last 8 years have been just devastating in terms of the people in defense who understood they needed to learn the human terrain. But the leadership was not going in that direction at all. And I think we are going to see a real shift. But the jobs are going to be very different. And I sort of wonder what the effect is going to be on the all-volunteer force.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes, sir, and then in the back.
Listening to your presentation, I'm reminded of a poster I saw in my youth during the Vietnam War that said, "Girls say yes to boys who say no." And I'm wondering whether there's any truth in this, that it seems that you just focus on young men but without the reproductive consequences of their participation in warrior culture. And the other aspect is, in the last generation, as women had been admitted to the service academies, and the service academies are approaching a closer to 50-50 ratio, how this first generation of female warriors in the Army, Air Force, and Navy, whether any research has yet emerged as to how this affects your conclusions.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting how women have entered the armed forces. They still haven't been in the front line in the trenches. We have a very technical way of warfare, and women can fly aeroplanes and program missiles as well as anybody else. We also read about a lot of sexual abuse of women in the armed forces. And I think the differences between males and females are so profound that you probably find it very difficult to integrate women into frontline forces. The only country I know that did this was Eritrea, which is quite remarkable because that's a country where we have genital mutilation, and women fought very bravely beside men. And my informant, an Eritrean, said when they had a really desperate fight, they often had sex afterwards, and the two things went together. One thing I learned writing this book was the true story, which I think is very revealing of the Black September movement. You may remember that this was Palestinians who had been ejected from Jordan and who had the attack on the Munich Olympics when they killed the Israeli athletes. And shortly after that, Yasser Arafat, as the head of the PLO, saw that he had an opportunity to have a voice at the United Nations, and he was frightened that the Black September might launch another one of these highly visible attacks. And also, these bands of young men are not always easily controlled. So the PLO leadership got together, and one of them said, what we ought to do is to take a flight load of pretty young Palestinian women to Beirut, introduce them to the Black September movement, and they said, if you marry, you will get a house with a refrigerator and a television set and $3,000. You will get a job. If you have a child, you get $5,000. And Black September, which is one of the most vicious terrorist movements, totally evaporated. And they were so surprised that they did the sort of experiments sociologists would like to do. They couldn't believe this had happened, so they went back to these people and they said, look, we have a non-violent mission for you to go to Geneva and carry some messages or something for the PLO. And the men said, we don't want to do this. We probably have our names on the European police list. We'll be arrested. And so they were happy having their children. Now, unfortunately, we don't have the resources to take all the angry young men in the world and give them a television set and a refrigerator. But I think that it's a very profound thing that men would rather be parents and fathering children than killing other people. And we want to look upstream for those things that could make that more common in somewhere like Gaza.
Okay, gentleman in the back.
Thank you. What you said gives a great caution to those who follow India and the Indian-Pakistan affair. I'm sure most people here know that the male-female ratio in India is really askew, and of course the population is growing. But I wonder if you've ever back-tested some of this to see how populations were constructed prior to wars for which you may have information. For example, Germany just before World War II. It's 20 years after World War I, and I'm sure there are a lot of other European cases where the data might be available.
As I understand it, before World War II, despite the losses in World War I, you had quite more rapid population growth and more of a youth bulge in the German population than you had in the French or the British population. So these youth bulges, as they're called, I mean, they're not causal of war, but they alert you to a more dangerous situation. I have many friends in Pakistan, but I do think it's the most dangerous country in the world. I think it's extraordinarily unstable. It's very violent. You've got really sort of bands of hooligans in Karachi holding people to ransom. You've got an educational system that cannot keep up with the vast expansion of young populations, so they go to madrasa schools and don't really learn very much except the Quran by heart. And you've got atomic weapons, and you've got a country which doesn't control quite a lot of its territory. It's in the hands of warlords, and it's going to get so much worse. I mean, that is what is so worrying. And one of the things that distresses me is how poorly we've looked ahead. I actually wrote the budgets for reproductive health in Afghanistan after the fall of the Taliban. And so there were people from the WHO and from UNICEF, and we were all doing our things about vaccinations and oral rehydration, and I was doing the family planning bit. And as the World Bank colleague was folding up his computer at the end, we had to make 1-year budgets, 2-year budgets, and sort of notional 10-year budgets. And I said, you do realize in 10 years' time there'll be 50% more people in Afghanistan. It has one of the most rapid population growths in the world. And the World Bank man said, oh shit, and he went like this, and we had another $300 million on the budgets. And it really came home to me that you have very, very intelligent professionals in places like the World Bank who are very humane and want to make the world a better place, who totally overlook the threat that very rapid population growth implies. This is a country where 12,000 women die every year in childbirth. More women die having children in Afghanistan than people were killed in the Taliban, at least in the recent wars. And so I think it can be very difficult to do family planning, but if we could have started that when the Taliban began, we would have done something. I was in the Gaza Strip when there was a hope of some sort of peace in the early 90s. I was working with my Arab friends. We had a good proposal to the European Union. The women wanted family planning. It wasn't picked up by anybody. This is incredibly short-sighted. Not only are we making women suffer, we're making ourselves suffer in an unstable world.
Question?
Maybe this is too much of a simple question, but I just wonder, why is there so much resistance to giving women reproductive rights or more power over their reproductive health? What's so scary about it?
And I'm sorry, before you answer that, I've been remiss in not asking other folks to identify themselves. If you could just, the questioners, let us know who you are.
Oh, sorry. I'm Mandy McAnally with PSI.
Thank you.
I think it's a very profound question, Randy, and my wife and I want our next book to be The End of Patriarchy. I think because of these evolutionary differences between males and females, that men do have, an evolved reason for trying to control female reproduction. I mean, if you have a child, there's no doubt it's got 50% of your genes. If a man thinks he's fathered a child, he might be cuckolded by somebody else. And you have this terrible double standard which runs so across the world, which I think has an evolutionary base, which doesn't excuse it in any way. I think it helps us confront it. And I think that when I practiced medicine as a young doctor, it was a very patriarchal way of approaching women. We got breast cancer, we wouldn't explain what we're going to do. We'd cut off somebody's breast. And we've got to change to a more equal world. And I think that patriarchy raises its ugly head if you just look the other way. And it's very, very hard to keep equality for women. And the first equality that women need, even before the vote and even before legal sort of empowerment, is the power to determine when to have a child. And I would quite fearlessly offer women methods of contraception, such as Depo-Provera, which they can do without consulting their partners if that's the world that they live in. And I think we should be very emphatic about that. I think we should be absolutely committed to offering women who are raped in refugee situations safe abortions. I think we should be fearless about that. I think the only thing worse than being raped as a woman is to be raped and pregnant. And we should get up and say that and not sort of pussyfoot around and say, well, it's controversial or something. It's not controversial to offer a raped woman a safe abortion.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, didn't we also cut funding? I met with nurses from Kenya who we cut funding. There is abortions outlawed there, but we cut funding to clinics where women tried to save the lives of women who had done their own abortions and botched them just to prevent orphans. And the last administration cut funding because they were trying to save lives of women who'd had abortions.
President Obama has restored that funding, and we're very pleased.
I should say, kind of to tie into this topic specifically and to go the step further in the title of the publication is Making the Case for Family Planning, and Margaret Noisa, who was here, Steve Sinding, Duff Gillespie, Liz McGuire, and Joe Spidell, who were 5 consecutive directors of USAID's Office of Population and Reproductive Health, have a report that really calls for ramping up these resources for a number of the reasons and many more that have been enunciated here. And Gib, I'm going to get it wrong, March 17th or March 17th. We'll have, I believe, 3 of those 5 here to present that report, and so we hope you'll come back and join us for that discussion. Other comments and questions? Yes, sir, and then we'll come back.
Thanks. I'm Jonathan Talbot with the Institute for Inclusive Security. My question is, given the, particularly nowadays and probably increasingly the technological basis of warfare and the political and economic decisions that have to go into producing the weapons that are then used by either gender. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts if one had to prioritize women in politics over women in the military, put aside that being sort of a false distinction. What do you think would get us to a better world faster?
I would like to see more women in politics. I mean, just having a woman leader like Margaret Thatcher doesn't solve our problems. I think we want to have legislatures which are at least half women, and somewhere like Rwanda is taking steps to actually make sure that's taking place. And I think that will lead to a more peaceful world. Certainly, the West, through its technical leadership, has an extraordinarily powerful weapons. And I think one of the most stupid things we do is to pass those out to other nations which we can see without very much difficulty are pretty unstable. You know, places like Pakistan. I mean, the Taliban is never going to make a shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missile. They're only going to fire it at us because we sold it to somebody or other. And that really is crazy. I think we've got to be much more careful with how we distribute our high technology weapons. The thing that frightened me most when I was writing this book was actually thinking through biological warfare, because that's quite low cost. I mean, the crazy attack in Japan on the underground was by one not very capable biochemist making sarin gas. And I think it's very frightening when you think what people can do with new scientific knowledge. So I think we want two things. One, to be very careful about our high-tech weapons and not let them get in the hands of other people. And then to be very wary of the dangers of biological warfare. I think increasing number of nations will acquire nuclear weapons, unfortunately, and probably Iran will, and I think it'll be less dangerous than Pakistan, which has already got them. And I must say my own country, England, was set the very bad example of being the second one in the world to want to have an atomic bomb. And I don't see how we're going to stop other people doing it. So I think we live in a very, very frightening world, and that we have to be very forceful in setting those policies which may ameliorate very, very frightening problems.
I saw something very frightening, just a quick aside, in Ethiopia. I was in the field with a team from Berkeley, international team in the Rift Valley for 2 weeks in December, and all these nomadic pastoralists, the Afar, have AK-47s. And some of them are boys that are maybe 14 years old, 14, 15, some of them chewing chat, which is like a methamphetamine. And they really kill each other. They slaughter each other. One clan had just killed 29 members of another clan over these border skirmishes. Even something as stupid as a water truck came in to drill a well, and they were shooting at the truck, which is really not a smart evolutionary strategy if you want there to be safe water for your children to survive.
Yeah, no, it's fine. And there's a huge number, of AK-47s and Kalashnikovs in the world at the end of the Cold War, and they're not going to go away. But if you want to be optimistic, Addis Ababa, which is a poor capital city in Africa, now has a two-child family. No demographer predicted that. And the rest of the country is having 5 or 6 children. And the reason, I believe, is that for about 10 years, an organization out of England, Maristopes International, has offered safe abortions to women in Addis Ababa and been very consistent and proactive that if a woman has an abortion, she gets contraceptive advice afterwards. And so people that are very poor are now having two-child families. And I think you could do that in the rest of Ethiopia, in the countries. If you look at the barriers, the current rule in Ethiopia is that the injectable contraceptive Depo-Provera, which women like because they can use it without their husband knowing, can only be given by doctors and nurses. There are no doctors and nurses in the villages of Ethiopia. So we've been training people in the villages to give injections, which is perfectly responsible. AID has also been a leader in that field, and I congratulate them. And we've got a couple of priests giving an injection in the arm. And the women are delighted. And when you work in this field, it's these very little things which get overlooked, which are very important, removing these barriers which are preventing women getting the information and technologies they need to control their fertility. And they need that because they're other human beings that we respect. We need them to do that because we live in a dangerous world. And I think that's something easy to do.
If I can ask a question of Anne, it's not fair to ask you to answer for journalism, but can I ask you to reflect on what, as someone who tries to follow these issues, perceives as a dearth of coverage from a wide set of journalism outlets, whether it's from the rights perspective, from the women's rights, a panoply on kind of family planning, population, some of these health-related, gender-based issues that often aren't sexy in the way that gets into the paper. Is that the editors, or is that the stories not being written, or do you have advice for how they could and should be framed and brought forward in ways that are more likely to go on, to go online now? It's not to be in the newspaper, but to be online, where journalism seems to be going.
Wish I had a solution. I'm puzzled why we don't cover overpopulation anymore either. I'm very interested in it. The stories that I've read lately have been more about nations paying their citizens to have more children because they're worried they won't be able to afford their older citizens in retirement. So they're trying to, I think, so Russia, you probably know this better than I do. We had a story in Science all about that and all the positives of boosting population growth. So that was a novel angle. That's probably what made that story more, made it new. You know, population, the old Paul Ehrlich population bomb, I guess because some of the early predictions didn't pan out. People see it as an old story rather than a current one. So I think the way to do this would be to talk about specific examples. I think the story of where women have controlled the number of children they have, that the socioeconomics improve, that's out. That's been written quite a bit. But I guess it's just specific case studies, people stories that work. What's working in Ethiopia? That's, I was thinking to myself, that city is fairly prosperous for an African city. And this must be part of the story. There's a lot that's positive there. So I guess the case studies, making the human stories where you can, new angles where there's maybe new funding. I think the alarm has gone away from the overpopulation story, but it's at the core of global warming. It's at the core of violence. It's so many things. So I don't understand that either.
Yeah, well, I think also perhaps to preview some research that's being done here and elsewhere as well, but even on the macro, some of our assumptions that all of us cite, the median-term projections of the UN and the kind of 9 billion figure, there are a number of places such as Kenya where those the assumption that you're going to come down to 2 children per family, those total fertility rates have stalled and are leveling out with big implications for where we could go in terms of numbers. It's not it really isn't a sexy story, but one that has really raises big questions for what we presume we know about what's going forward. And of course, those numbers come down when we make all sorts of efforts and invest in making this stuff available. But, yes, sorry, a couple more questions. Why don't we just go up and then we'll come down and then over.
My name is George Pick. I am an independent scholar. I would like to ask the professor, you showed a chart which was essentially only limited to the Middle East. Yeah. But I am interested in what happens in China, where we know that we already have a big disequilibrium between men and women with the one-child policy. And will that have any kind of long-term consequences?
I think China is more stable because it doesn't have this huge number of angry young men. There is an imbalance in the sex ratio, but men tend to marry women younger than themselves. I think China is more stable, whatever its current problems, than it was during the Cultural Revolution, which was basically a civil war, when it had a huge bulge of young testosterone-filled men. The present economic catastrophe has just unemployed about 20 million people in China, and that may destabilize this huge country. But I worry less about China than I do about some of the countries in the Middle East. You go to China, you've got the man pushing the bassinet with his one child, and most of them have got jobs at the present moment. You've got education. China will may well overtake the US as the economic powerhouse of the world, but personally, it doesn't frighten me in the way that Pakistan does. India is just split into two nations, unfortunately, and there's never been a really strong drive to get meaningful family planning to those great populous states like Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. And again, it goes back, I think, to patriarchy. The medical profession, to which I'm proud to belong, is nevertheless quite patriarchal, and it doesn't like to give up control of things. And the villages of India don't have any of the MBBS, the MD type doctors. They have rural medical practitioners, and the laws and regulations prevent those people putting in intrauterine devices or doing safe abortions, which I'm sure I could teach them to do, or some of them anyhow. So, often I think we have to continually look at the details, the trend towards patriarchy, which keeps coming up, which is to control things as if it's dangerous to give women control over their fertility. I think it's one of the greatest freedoms that we can offer the world. And yet there's enormous restriction. Keeping the pill on prescription. We should take the pill off prescription in this country, and then we might take it off prescription in Uganda, where it's still on prescription. Any rich person can get it, but a poor woman can't. It's the same with abortion. There's no country in this world where a rich woman cannot get a safe abortion. There's a large number of countries where women are suffering terribly because they can't get safe abortions and they're poor. And you mentioned Kenya. I mean, fertility was coming down in Kenya because a fair amount of effort, often led by USAID, was put into making a rather in-your-face but still very voluntary program of family planning. That really collapsed after the Cairo conference, and people tried to do a broad range of things, I think all of which were very well-intentioned, all of which everybody in this room would support, but they did too many things and achieved very little. And the stall in fertility in Kenya has taken the projection for the population of Kenya in 2050 from 53 million, which would be pretty terrifying, to about 80 million. I think that's a recipe for a failed state. Kenya will be like Somalia. And even if you have the right policies about conservation or the use of energy, you won't be able to make them work. And so we really can't waste another millisecond getting things back on track and getting strong leadership to say this is something that we have to do if we want to live, if we want to do anything to ameliorate the world's problems.
Okay, down here, and then we'll work across. Yeah, please.
Mihira Kara, Officer Population, USAID. We've talked a lot about family planning and population, but there are a lot of other things that makes me feel extremely pessimistic about the world. Yep. In family planning, we know what to do. If we had the resources, we know where to go. Yes. But whatever we do will still take quite a bit of time. Meanwhile, I think we have pushed our planet to the limit when it comes to resources, and I don't know if we know enough about regeneration of our resources, because the root of war is, again, resources. Yep. And the danger is not just in the Pakistans and the Indias and the Middle Easts of this world. You mentioned weapons, and just because it's in the hands of the Western world doesn't mean it's safe. No. The fact is the Western world starts wars because of resources. I mean, we went into Iraq. Let's be open about it, for the oil.
Yes,
I mean, it's those kinds of resources. And so if the resources are not there and we are getting, it's just not going to get any better. And by the time our planet stabilizes in the numbers, I don't know what will happen to our resources. I don't think we are getting any better.
I agree. I think it's a very, very frightening situation. I used to worry a lot about running out of oil and natural gas. What we're actually going to run out of is atmosphere to absorb the pollution that comes from burning fossil fuels. And that's a very sophisticated thing. It's very difficult to convince people of that. But, and again, when you predict the future, we can predict population reasonably well. A lot of the parents of children going to be born alive in 2050 are already here. It's very difficult to predict interactions, for example, between, we can know a certain amount about global warming, but how that interacts with melting Arctic ice, and you get more reflection or less reflection of the sun's rays, and more clouds or less clouds. Those are very difficult things. And so we really don't know what we're going to do in global warming between perhaps 1 degree Fahrenheit and 8 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century. And 8 degrees would be, might reverse the Gulf Stream. I mean, we face incredibly formidable and profound problems. I think we have a lot of information. I think you're absolutely right. We certainly know how to do family planning. We just have to set the policies and find the money. And it's not huge amounts of money in relation to buying a Raptor aeroplane or something or other. But we need to be scientifically informed, and we haven't been for 8 years. Now I hope that we will be. And again, I'm proud to be an American citizen. I came from the United Kingdom. I came because of America's leadership in family planning at one time. And this is, a country that has to reestablish its leadership, its respect for other people, its basing decisions on science, and its generosity in helping less privileged people, which we can still afford to do, even in the face of our economic downturn. And we have the knowledge to do that, and we need to do it, because if we don't do it, the world is going to hell in a handbasket. And we will suffer as much as people in Indonesia will. Well, the poor will always suffer more than the rich, but we will certainly suffer. And if we have more wars, then the end is very frightening.
Hey, the gentleman here, and then we'll come down and come down here.
Hi, my name's Mark Dosh. I'm with Wizard Window Washing. I was reminded, I'm an English major from college, and I was reminded of a story called about Lysistrata, which, if I remember correctly, is a story about a group of women who organized to withhold sex to keep guys from going out and waging war, right? So I was reminded of that when the gentleman over here talked about Vietnam, women saying yes to men who said no. Are there actually, I was just curious, this is maybe a silly question, but are there actually any historical instances where such a thing was ever tried or used, or or for the future, if that's a possibility, for any group of women or, someplace in our country, or do women always support their men in their testosteronic poisoning?
Yeah, I think women are very savvy, and if a man has got riches and power, it becomes attractive to a woman. There's a recent report I saw out of New Guinea of women in the highlands in New Guinea being sort of representing our sort of living Stone Age. There's extraordinary amounts of violence. And some of the women had begun to systematically kill their male children. They wanted to change the sex ratio towards the female because they were just so worn out by this perpetual fighting between the men. That's a pretty radical way to deal with things. I'm not promoting it. But I would like just to circle back to the bonobos, which I think a lot of people are learning about, these rather peaceful another species of chimpanzee. They weren't distinguished as a separate species till 1929. Their skeletons looked like other chimps. They have a very different social life. And most chimpanzees live in areas where there used to be gorillas. Chimps eat fruit and gorillas eat leaves. Where the bonobos exist, they are no gorillas and they eat leaves as well as fruit. So they go around in larger groups. And in the dry season, the Pantroglodytes, Jane Goodall's chimps, have to spread out a lot just to find food. And that's when they tend to be attacked. And this team aggression is a very low-risk strategy. If you've got 4 or 5 males and you attack an isolated individual in the next troop, I've not heard of any attackers ever being killed. I think in the bonobos, they don't split up into these small groups. They go around in little clusters. So this strategy probably disappeared, I think, for that reason. I think it's just an ecological reason that goes back to resources. And then the social life, as Anne said, of these animals changed. And when one of Jane Goodall's chimps, when a female reaches maturity, she leaves the territory of her birth and goes into another territory. Males have never been seen to leave the territory in which they're born. When she enters the next troop, she has a very tough time. All the males want to have sex with her. She doesn't know where she is. She doesn't know where the tools are. The other females aren't particularly welcoming. In the case of bonobos, when a female is sexually mature, she goes into the next troop and she makes a same-sex pleasurable relationship with another female. And this is they have great times. They're having lots of heavy breathing. And the males recognize that if you attack a female bonobo, her female friend will come and they may be smaller than the males, but the two of them together will. And it's very interesting, I think, to have another primate that changes its social structure by non-procreative sex. We, I think, have changed our social structure by non-procreative sex, by joining men and women in some sort of long-term sexual relationship that carries the very heavy burden of these large brains, helpless babies that we have. And I think that's very revealing. But I don't think we'll get a huge number of Lysistrata women to refuse men's sex, unfortunately. It'd be nice if we could do that.
Although the men would just get more frustrated.
Yes, yeah, more violent.
More violent.
Okay, yes, we had a question here, and then the gentleman in the middle. Why don't we do right here and then get that microphone ready for the gentleman.
This program here is run by Environmental Change and Security Program, and you're talking about population, environment, and security. Very interesting. I was here 2 weeks ago. Two gentlemen from Georgetown Center were arguing that the West is losing population and it's going negative. And my question to you is, do you think it's a bad thing from a security point of view for negative population growth in the advanced countries that were identified by them as in Europe and I think Canada, Australia, and the United States? And second of all, if you're saying through history that aggression comes from having population, particularly of males with testosterone, isn't the West in trouble in trying to maintain itself against other groups like these gentlemen were arguing?
No, I think if we look at the recent fighting in Gaza, the Israelis have a technically very capable military force. I think 13 Israelis were killed and 2,000 people in Gaza died. Now, without taking any sides in that conflict, I think that technically advanced warriors will always win, and you don't need a huge population to do that. Secondly, I'm not frightened myself by some population decline in somewhere like Italy. I mean, Italy will have as many people in 2050 as it probably had in 1960 when I first went there, and it seemed to me a perfectly nice country. We do have many more healthy years of life than we used to have, and the British have shown that if you slowly raise the age of retirement, even if you were to raise it by 2 years, by 2025, you would overcome most of the economic problems of keeping the older people alive, and that's a very realistic and achievable goal. So we have to adjust to an aging population, and it would be better if the world didn't have these violent swings from very high population growth rates to very slow ones, because you get a very distorted population pyramid. But we've made a lot of mistakes and we have to live with them. And I personally don't find the low fertility which we have in parts of Europe threatening. I think it's very interesting that when women get control of their fertility through good contraception and safe abortion, they choose to have very few children. In Sweden, where there's some equality between men and women, they seem to have to choose 2 children. In Sicily or Greece, where you've had more patriarchal societies, once they get control of their fertility, they say, I'm stopping at 1. You know, you have these 1.3 families. And if we want to have slightly more children in parts of Europe, then I think, again, we've got to go for more equality between men and women, because I think the women will have more children when they think the man's going to do something to help them. When the man expects them to earn money and clean the house and do all the cooking, as they do in Russia, and he's going to get drunk on vodka, then the women are going to say, I'm stopping at 1. And if you have a more equitable balance between the sexes, I think a lot of people will want to have 2 children, and that'll be rather nice.
Sir.
First, I'd like to thank all of you for a fascinating presentation. My name is John Shurlis. I'm an advisor to the Bonobo Conservation Initiative, which we work to facilitate the efforts of Congolese partners in securing their own future, the rainforest habitat that they share with bonobos. And we do that by working on livelihood and also female empowerment. I also wanted to mention, pursuant to Malcolm Potts' representation of the idea the theory about the reasons for the differences between chimps and bonobos, that in fact Richard Wrangham, who shares his intellectual lineage from Cambridge University with Jane Goodall, a student of his, Alexander Georgiev, did embark on an effort to do this in a comparative study between chimpanzees at Richard's site in Kibale and bonobos at one of our sites, Kokolo Paris, which is where one can go if one is willing to go upriver for 8 days in pirogues, and then observe within hours habituated groups of bonobos. But the result, there is still a long way to go in sorting out that hypothesis, but it is the most robust one to date. What I'm wondering about really is that taking into account the long-standing relationship between hard science, biology, observations of animal behavior, and interest in public policy or very applied issues that Mitzi was referring to with respect, for example, the DoD, the late Hugh Cott, the great expert on animal mimicry and adaptive coloration at Cambridge University, was consulting with the British government about camouflage for the war effort in the Second World War. Harvard's Irvin DeVore was called down to advise on whether it's the trade-off between the possible effect on allies versus potential opponents of having weapons on battleships visible or masked. But in this case, you're volunteering your ideas in this wonderfully hosted attempt at bringing together science and ideas about human origins and public policy. But my question really is whether you've taken into account in the strategy that you employ, perhaps implicitly in representing your argument in your book, the very observations you include in your book. For example, the significance of, again, an Irvin DeVore lineage, the newly emerged discipline of evolutionary psychology, in how you present it, and that has to do with the question of your target audience and whether or not they're going to be initially openly interested in this or whether you have to somehow get their attention, and if so, how?
I'm trying to learn, how interested the military will be in these ideas. I've preliminary experiences that they can be interested. I hope we can interest them more. And I think, one of the reasons that I appreciate, and I think, and as well been here today, is to start a conversation. I mean, to look at war and terrorism in new ways. We're not saying we're necessarily interpreting things correctly. Being prepared to learn from other animals. And I think one of the tragedies of the 21st century is we're probably going to destroy the habitat of all the large apes in the world, just as we're beginning to learn from them. It's a tragedy in the because they're wonderful animals, but also because we're depriving ourselves of information which we very much need. We need, to understand ourselves, and one of the best ways of doing that, I think, is to look at other animals and where we've come from, to look at our own history. But there were a lot of scientifically qualified people in the military, and I think we should share information with them, and I think they're going to be interested. I hope they are.
I might just add to that. We have in this coming set of 6 essays on demographic security a piece called Population and Defense Policy Planning that was written by Jennifer Shuba, who was sitting at the Office of Secretary of Defense Policy Planning, looking at demographic issues. We have Rich Sincata in the back at the National Intelligence Council, who's expert on this and familiar to many who've been to fora here before, looking at connections between all variety of population variables, kind of broadly defined, and conflict. So I think you're right that there are people on the inside who are very interested in it, and we're seeing it start to be reflected in not just having good analysts inside, but, for example, some of the higher level doctrine. So you'll find on our blog, New Security Beat, Jen Shuba kind of goes point by point with the National Defense Strategy that came out last year and talk about how demography is fundamentally integrated into both threat and opportunity, perceived as both threat and opportunity in this context. So they're starting to be hooks that you can hang a hat on in terms of looking at these issues in that context.
Going back to the Congo and the bonobos, I mean, are you actually taking contraception to these people? We started a project around Gombe National Park with Jane Goodall, and the people implementing this project were really quite frightened, that when they went to these villages where people having 6 or 7 children, that they really wouldn't be welcome. I mean, these are either very fundamentalist Muslim villages or Catholic villages. And the villagers said, why didn't you come earlier? And one of the men, who I think had 8 children, became the greatest promoter of family planning. But the second thing about that study was that in my book I was very disappointed because we wanted to train people in the villages to distribute contraceptives. And the rules in Tanzania is you have to train people for 3 weeks to do that. Now that I think is totally crazy. First of all, a woman in the village who might be very good at distributing contraceptives can't leave her family for 3 weeks. If it's a little shopkeeper, she can't leave the shop for 3 weeks. It's enormously expensive, and it doesn't achieve anything more than you could teach somebody in 2 days, which is what I've done in Thailand and places. So it's really just, when you turn your back in family planning, it becomes this incredibly conservative thing. And people say, well, family plan's a good idea, but you've got to do all these things. And it's all these things which get in the way and which deprive women of choices. And, if you're working in the Congo, you should be taking pills and condoms in the villages either to sell or to give away, whatever the culture wants, and listen to what the people want. Because I always say, family planning is not telling people what to do, it's listening to what they want.
Also, I noticed something in New Guinea. I was traveling with a medical anthropologist in Papua New Guinea, staying in villages with her. And she would help the women start industries like dipping bed nets and permethrin, anti-malarial. When the women got a little money, they spent it on the children and on food. Unfortunately, the men were spending it on betel nut and beer. But so little industries that help the women get some income, empowered, and access to family planning and feeding their children.
Mm-hmm. And in some ways, trying to take Anne's advice on telling success stories and putting human faces on it. Hopefully you will pick up and avail yourselves of the Focus series that's out there that really tries to capture with very specific experiences and people's experiences this integrated population health environment programs that are done for and with populations living in and around centers of biodiversity, programs that are often funded, if not always funded, by USAID, and also the Packard Foundation has been leading in that. And there are case studies on Uganda, Philippines, and Nepal is coming, and some others out there that I hope people will avail themselves. Would you like to follow up, sir? Yes, please.
Just to respond, I think certainly if the funds were forthcoming, I can't speak on behalf of BCI, the Bonobo Conservation Initiative, but I'm sure they'd be extremely interested indeed in being able to bring contraception and other measures. They did establish a clinic there. I also just wanted to acknowledge the key role in another lineage, which was the great human paleontologist Louis Leakey.
Yes.
And it's Leakey, of course, whom we have to thank for what we do know. I mean, in large part, his relationship with the National Geographic Society, and Jane Goodall with the chimpanzees, Baruti Galdicos Brindamore with orangutans, and late Diane Fossey with gorillas. And there was no Jane Goodall of the bonobos, which is one of the reasons why bonobos are so little known. The first work was done by Japanese scientists only just over 30 years ago. But further to that, if you don't mind, I would actually like to lobby for support. There's something that anyone watching this video and any of us here can do, which is to urge our representatives, senators, for those of us who are not in the District of Columbia, and representatives in the House, to regularly support and possibly one day close to the amount that it was actually authorized, as opposed to the much lesser amount that it was appropriated, the Great Ape Conservation Act of 2000, which was administered by the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. And that act, which also includes the so-called lesser ape, has been a pivotal, very significant force in great ape conservation since it was first funded in 2001.
Thank you.
Terrific. We did get a question from online from Barcelona. Actually, staying up late. We appreciate you doing that, and it's really a clarification question. So Raul Garcia would like to know about whether we're suggesting that higher testosterone levels are directly correlated with being more violent.
There are interesting studies on people playing games, and that if you have a game of soccer, they'll tend to be higher testosterone in the two teams, and then the losing team, it goes down very rapidly and they feel depressed. And this has been shown in games of chess. And the one that really amuses me is Frenchmen playing dominoes. And that when they are playing dominoes, which seems to me the gentlest of all possible games, with the next village, they have a higher testosterone level than when they're playing dominoes with their own group. So there's a sort of in-group, out-group thing. So, you know, testosterone in men is very kind of responsive and goes up and down because we're making it in our testes. Women also have testosterone, but it comes from the adrenal glands and it doesn't have this ability to sort of go up and down that it does in men. And you measure it by chewing gum. So I am fascinated by, you know, the information which we do have on testosterone. And I have a friend in Mexico who owned a football team. And he said he's a rich man. He sold it because he was so depressed in the week that they lost. And I think this kind of withdrawal of testosterone seems to make men very, very kind of deflated. It's an extraordinary hormone.
Okay. Well, yes, a gentleman in the back, please.
Water Diggs, USA Global Health. Further to the discussion about engaging military leadership, for example, and testosterone and so on, and this certainly doesn't apply to Pittsburgh, but it does apply to international warfare. I think it's agreed that although young men are willing to die, it's old men that make them die. So what's your take on the biology of this? Is this residual testosterone or?
I think with or without probably always have to have some testosterone, that men are intrinsically quite competitive. I mean, it's interesting that the Turkish Sultanate used eunuchs as their diplomats. And they probably were better diplomats. In fact, I have an out-of-the-box idea which I would like to float in front of you, and it's that we should amend the American Constitution that only women or eunuchs can run for president of the United States.
There's your headline, folks, right there. Yeah.
So are women changing, though? I'm thinking there's stories now about girls in sports, many more injuries, playing much more competitively. I wonder how our hormone levels are changing. If there's any
I think it's
going on there.
Socially correct, you know, to do these things. And clearly, I mean, if you look at something which we can measure like crime in women, if you look at Dubai or somewhere or other where women are really sort of incarcerated, they don't count for more than 1% of the crime. If you look for women in Jamaica, where they're often the only person running the home, they're owning the shops, then I think about 20% of the people who do violent crimes are women. And always there's also overlapping curves in all our behaviors, and so which is part of the richness of life. So I think there'll always be some women that are more competitive than others, just as there are some men that are less competitive. But the means will be quite far apart.
Well, I think we've reached a good stopping point, and I'm mindful that we have a reception to continue the conversation, to give you an opportunity to go out and buy the book, and perhaps Malcolm will even sign it for you. But before we do that, please join me in thanking both Anne and Malcolm for today's discussion.